Hello, and welcome to Nomadic Diaries, the re-entry series. I'm Doreen Cumberford, the host.
And I'm Linda Mueller, the co-host. Hi, this is Linda Mueller, and I'm here with Doreen Cumberford. And today we are talking about the theme of farewells. And I would say that I'm glad we're putting this in the spotlight because it's really, for me, the keystone of the entire repatriation process in many ways. So what do you think, Doreen, about farewells, just on a high level? I'm sure you've had many. How many times have you actually repatriated? Remind us.
Well, I've repatriated like 3.5 times. And I say I have because I was married to someone who was repatriating. I was expatriating. He was repatriating, and the marriage broke. So thus the half.
We've talked about how repatriations are so unique, and just what you described is a prime example of that, right? You were expatriating, he was repatriating, and the relationship didn't work. I mean, that's pretty individual, pretty unique.
Yeah. And there are many factors involved in all of our lives. And so I am just really excited about this subject, Linda.
Well, and I think it's important to point out that it's often shadowed by logistics, which we talked about as a theme for last week, because I think people get, I'm going to make my farewells. I'm going to throw a big party. And as I walk around, I'll point out like, this is the last time I'm going to be at the post office or whatever it may be. But to me, that's not really what we're trying to get at here. I think sometimes people are too rushed or stressed or upset, and they think that focusing on farewells, whatever that may be, is like self-indulgent. And so they kind of move past it. I think another thing that happens is that people think it's too sad and they don't want to address it because it's hard. There's this sense of melancholy, especially for people that don't want to leave their host country, or perhaps even if they don't mind leaving their host country, they're going to a situation that's not quite as positive as the one they're in. I mean, repatriations come in all shapes and sizes, really. Yes. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's really what we want to try to do today is talk about how the farewells can be empowering. And when I think of my own repatriation farewells, like a mix of feelings come up, like the tears, the laughter, the hugs, the promises that we make to people that we're saying farewell to, and more tears. I mean, honestly, when I think about my repatriations, there was always a lot of tears because the one theme, I repatriated 3 times as a student, which was always sad, but it was kind of expected. And then 3 times with my family. And the common theme was I never wanted to leave my host country. It wasn't that I didn't want to go back to my passport country, which is the United States, but I truly didn't want to leave. How about you? Can you relate to that, Doreen?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Farewells have been rocky for me. I think I've gotten much better at them over the years. The older I've gotten, the more frequency with which I practiced it, but also being more thoughtful going into the process of what I wanted out of it.
Right. That's a really important point. I've always carved out time for farewells with a focus on the future and trying to continue what I've created in this chapter of my life in my host country. And I think this is what I'm trying to get at with empowerment, like looking at it that way, being forward thinking and honoring what you've created is really sort of taking your power back. Because I think during repatriation, it's easy to fall into martyr or victim mode. And that really takes your power away from you.
Yeah. You can easily feel very disempowered during repatriation, depending on the circumstances. But yeah.
Well, and I like that we're using the word farewell because I think goodbyes are sad, but farewell, the term farewell means, I wish you well in your next chapter or in your travels or whatever it may be. It's not just goodbye, end of discussion, end of relationship. It's just more like we're looking towards the future. It's like, I think of it as like a metaphysical embrace that's full of hope and a bright future. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm saying this with a lot of hindsight, But I really do look at it that way now. And I've started to look at this stage as a gift to myself because as we talked about earlier, it's so easy to get caught up in the logistics and it might feel indulgent to carve out time for it. But I think it's really the most important thing to take the time to celebrate what you've created and also to grieve what you're losing. Because as you and I have talked about offline and online, I mean, there's a lot of loss associated with repatriation. We're losing relationships, a way of life, maybe it's a job community or a school community. I mean, the list is endless, really. And so I think it's super important not to sugarcoat those losses and to know that they're real and that they can be deeply painful, because acknowledging that can help us pass through them and make the next phase a lot more positive.
And processing them and just really listening to the way we feel, articulating it, getting support if we need the support, and then finally taking action.
Exactly. And I think, like we talked about with logistics, even your farewells are going to be impacted by your circumstances and how much time you have available. And one thing that I really want to point out here as I move into some sort of strategies and expert tips that we can both share with everybody listening is that you don't have to complete your farewells before you leave your host country. There are things that you can do after you've left to get the closure that you need to move forward. It's not ideal, but we all have to work with what we're given. And sometimes there's a lot of things that we can't control.
I think that's a very good point. I think that there are many ways to say farewell. And I know a lot of people do so by writing a letter to the country, dear so-and-so, dear Mexico, thank you for, this is what I enjoyed, this is what you gave me. And so there's many, many ways that we can articulate this that are healthy.
I like that. I hadn't even thought of that one. I'm going to start. Well, the first one I'm going to start with is mindset, because this is a way to empower ourselves to focus on what we can control.
Yeah.
And I, like I said, have never wanted to leave any of my host countries. So I'm definitely poster child for somebody that did not embrace repatriation immediately. I've learned going through it tough ways to do things differently moving forward. So I think it's really important, like you brought up, being intentional, like be present, create memories. Just because you're leaving doesn't mean it all ends. Like I think some of my best memories are knowing that I was leaving and doing things that were just so fun. And because I was present, I enjoyed them more than I would have otherwise. I want to add self-compassion, because repatriation is hard. It's messy, but we have to be kind to ourselves and feel all the feelings and not shame ourselves or our loved ones for feeling them as well. Focusing on the priorities, always kind of thinking like, what do I need to do to move forward? Like all of this is your mindset, because you can control your mindset. Managing boundaries and expectations of both of yourself and of others, because sometimes we have this idea of how our farewell should be, and other people have things going on in their lives as well. So just managing all of that. And finally, watching your words, because what you say not only impacts your own mindset, but it impacts those that are around you. So I think, being present, being intentional, having self-compassion, and then watching how we express things is really important. Did you have anything else to add about mindset that I didn't throw out there?
Well, one of the things that just occurred to me was that there was some farewells that we have gone through that were really emotional and heart-wrenching and really meaningful. And there were others that were stuffy, corporate, boring experiences that I railed against. I think because I was so much in the process of railing against them and being critical of it. I think I just didn't see where I was in the process. I remember a farewell by the beach in the executive club somewhere in Saudi Arabia. I'm thinking, these speeches are going to go on forever, because they were saying farewell to a number of people who had been there a long time, many of whom had maybe 20 or 30 years of service with the one corporation. And so it was highly appropriate. I remember not being very present to that. And so I think sometimes it's difficult to see yourself in the picture when you're the frame. And so I think we have to make an attempt to do that when we're in the midst of the farewell. And
That's
you
a good
find
point.
yourself in a situation where you're going like, this is not the way I want to say goodbye.
Well, it's good. I mean, I think what you're saying is if we're self-aware, then we can catch ourselves and regroup more quickly than just going through on autopilot. The second one I'm just going to throw out quickly because it's pretty straightforward is self-care. I think when we get busy, the first thing we do is say, okay, well, I don't need to go for my run today, or I don't need to go for my walk today. But I just think that this is another way to empower ourselves. If we can stay strong, we can stay strong mentally and physically. We can get the things done that we need to get done. And we can also enjoy the time, because it's no fun to have a cold, your last 2 weeks in a place and feel like you can't wrap things up the way you want to, or whatever it may be. So I just wanted to throw that one in there quickly. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, I think that self-care, we could talk about self-care for 40 hours a week on the subject. And I think it is the first thing that slips. And many of us we just have to stay in that constant awareness and bring ourselves back to the present, and also bring ourselves back to the physical, because our heads are so full of transitions and emotions and logistics that actually bringing yourself fully present for just a couple of moments can be a minute of self-care. And it does not have to be long. It does not have to take a long time, but you can do this in just a few seconds or a minute.
Well, and those first
meditation.
Yes. Yeah, we'll have to add some to the link, because, there's all different forms of meditations and whatnot that people can do. Those first two things were really more internal, but really when I think of farewells, I also really think of it in three ways. It's sort of the people, the places, and the things. And for me, and I think for many people, the people are at the core of that. Yeah. That's always been the most important thing for me in each of my host countries, is who have I met, who's impacted my life. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they became long-term friends, but even the people that I met on the periphery that were in my daily or weekly life, meant something to me and to my experience. So sure. I just wanted to point that out. Is there something you wanted to add?
No, I think that's very important, but it usually is the people. And I find that even now, I mean, we just had a family wedding, and so many of the people that commented are people that the bride knew as a very young child, 30 years ago.
Amazing.
So it's very important to acknowledge things like that.
Well, and I think so, people are at the core. And I think for myself, I found, depending on how much time I have, the closest friends, of course, you want to do something really special with. And it's whatever's meaningful to you in that relationship. And then sort of the more distant the friends are, maybe you have a big party where you invite people that you knew pretty well and very well. And then, then there's the other people, the guy at the dry cleaner in Tokyo who wouldn't speak to me in English when I told him I didn't speak Japanese, but then started speaking some English as I started speaking some Japanese. I went in and tried to explain to him that I was moving back to America, and he acted sad. And it was just this closure that I needed. And I feel like saying goodbye to people, places, and things it can empower you, and it can bring closure that you need. I also think that the places and the things are important because they're all so important to the overall experience that they deserve a special moment. For example, when we left London, my daughter and I went to the coffee shop that we used to go to when we first moved there to use the Wi-Fi. And we sat there and we talked about, remember that? We used to sit here for hours. And we just kind of reminisced about all the things that had happened in the 2 years that we lived in London. And I brought our point cards, so we got a free coffee. But, anyway, it's just, I look back on that time with my daughter, and that gave me closure in that town that we were living in and created so many memories. And I also think that there's the things, we talked about this a bit with logistics. We can't take everything back with us, but what are the things that we want to take? And what are the things that we want to give to friends? Like I had these beautiful orchids in Tokyo that I gave to a friend, and she's Japanese, so I knew she was going to be there. And every time they would bloom, she would send me a picture and say, look, here are your orchids. They came back to life. And it kept me connected to her, but it also just warmed my heart to get those pictures. So, there's so many ways to reminisce, and it's all so individual, but I just wanted to throw out a few of those examples of things that I've done so that people can perhaps think about what would be meaningful for them. And how about you, Doreen? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Well, I think also there is a part of saying goodbye to the culture because, culture is in front of us. It's something we can see, hear, touch, smell sometimes, but it's also extremely subtle, particularly if we become a speaker of that language. And I think that it's really important to say, articulate a farewell to the culture.
I like that.
I think it's important to make words and attach them to what the culture has done for us, how it has expanded us, how changed we are as people as a result of being connected to the intercultural experience. And I think that it's very important to have rituals in order to, and that's one of the things, I have a chapter on rituals in the book. I just think that for me, that is very meaningful to say an acknowledgement to the culture.
I love that. And I'm going to jump into rituals because I have a few that my family has adopted. As I've shared before, we made 7 international relocations in and out of the US over 13 years. And so we got pretty good at saying goodbye on both sides, when we're expatriating and repatriating. So one thing I already talked about was we will pick a few things, a few places that are important to our family, and we'll go. And while we're there, we'll sort of talk and maybe even take a photo, but, talk about what are the best meals that we had while we were in this country, or what are the best trips we took while we lived here? Like just to sort of summarize and remind each other of the good times that we've had in those places. I mean, when we're visiting a place to say goodbye, sometimes it's not actually a physical place. It's more of a walk that we used to take regularly. And combining visiting a place with remembering the important things, it's heartwarming for me. And it also gives me a sense of closure. And we also have always collected mementos, something specific that reminds us of a place. And one of the things is we've picked up a rock from different places that we've lived, and we have them now in our backyard here in Chicago. And when I walk by, they're in a little pile. And when I see them, it reminds me of all the places that we've lived and vacationed. Now, don't do it if it's illegal. I know some places, they don't want you taking stuff, so don't do it. But, it can even be music. Like there's songs that remind me of places I've lived. So, I mean, it can be really anything. And then, of course, the other ritual is we always have a sayonara party. And I've done it, like you were talking about your friend who let people go and take what she wanted. I did it in a little more controlled way, like a raffle. And I had the best prizes at the end and people got to pick. And it actually made for a really fun party because everybody left with something that they wanted. And it just, like we talked about before, it made it easier to give things away because then, it's going to a good home. So those are some of the rituals, that we have adopted. Do you have any rituals?
Oh, yes. Well, one of the rituals is that I go through all the rooms and I acknowledge the space. This is from my background when I was doing a lot of design work before I moved to Tokyo, before I moved to Yokohama in Japan. And I would just acknowledge the space and thank the space for hosting us. And then my husband is always the one to leave the door last and lock the door. I don't want to be the one to lock the door and feel like I'm never coming back.
Oh, interesting.
So that's our final ritual when we leave a place. And yes, we've just developed so many rituals over the years. There's certain little glass Egyptian ornaments that we saved through the years in Saudi, and they come out every Christmas. And from Girls' Day in Japan, we still have the little set of dolls from Girls' Day in Japan that comes out on the 5th of March, which is close to my daughter and my birthday. We have so many things that are related to the things that we kept, when we use them, and what time we use them. And for what ceremonies we use them, because we keep making sure that we take these ceremonies and we've kind of packaged them and packed them up and taken them with us.
I love it. I have a couple of those things too that we still bring out, especially from Japan. So
Yeah.
you're bringing back nice memories for me. Well, I just wanted to kind of wrap it up with a couple quick expert tips. The first one is accept the love. When you're leaving and people want to treat you, help you, support you, accept it. Because at the time you might not think you need it, but it will give you closure. It'll wrap it up in a bow.
Yeah.
The second one is stack. I mean, I use this in my everyday life, but basically when you're repatriating, especially if you're short on time, there's ways to stack activities so that you're saying farewell and getting things done. So for example, if there's a few things you want to go buy before you leave the country, invite a good friend to come with you, because then you're creating memories, you're making it's part of your farewell with that friend and you're getting something done. So I could go on and on about stacking, but I think stacking is a really important tip for when you're trying to make things happen. And then this one's a bit of a luxury, but if you can, think about the future. If you're able to make a return trip within the next year or so, it makes the farewells a bit easier. But that is, again, a luxury. So maybe it's not that, but maybe a good friend is also from your same home country and you can make a plan to meet up when they're on home leave. And if nothing else, make plans to stay in touch regularly, especially in the beginning, because that can be part of your support team when you're landed, that if you've got that connection. And it might take a little vulnerability with a friend to say, look, I know it's going to be really hard for me on the other end, but can we just make a plan to talk once a week or once every 2 weeks or whatever works? And then last but not least, and again, this is a big hindsight tip, but when you move abroad, think with the end in mind, because a lot of times, and I've been guilty of this because I moved 2 different places where I thought I was going to be there 5 to 7 years and I ended up leaving in less than 2. So don't put the trips off. When you get there, what are your priorities, and start doing them, because not only is there a time factor, but some of these things are expensive. And so if you pace it out, then you don't end up in this last minute crunch where you don't have extra money and time to make it all happen. And those are it's another way to just try to make the whole process more simple.
It simplifies it, and it also gives you a different sense of closure. And we need all kinds of different senses of closure in order to really download closure. Does that make sense?
That makes great sense. Is there anything else you wanted to add, like in terms of expert tips?
This is great. No, I don't think there is.
So there's one quote that I wanted to read before we close this out. There is something unfinished about not saying farewell, like a door left open in the chill night. Julie C. Dow, she's an author that's written some adult and young adult books, but I thought that was very fitting for farewells when you're repatriating. And I thought it was interesting that you brought up your husband closing the door and locking it last.
Yeah, we just, over the years, that's just something that we've developed, and we make a very conscious effort. But I'm the one that walks through every room and says goodbye and thank you for the space.
Well, I hope you'll look at farewells as your bridge to the future, having listened to everything that we've had to share, and it's worth investing the time. So I just want to thanks for being here. If you know someone who has or will move back home from abroad, please send them a link to Repatriation Diaries. We want to connect with as many globally mobile people as possible